The bell rings before dawn. Not a gentle chime, a hard, insistent iron clang that cuts through the cold Levantine darkness like a blade. You have been asleep for perhaps 4 hours. Your bed is a straw pallet on a stone floor. Your pillow, if you have one at all, is your folded cloak. The cell around you measures roughly 8 feet by 6. There is no fire. There is no comfort. There is only the bell and the rule and the fact that every man in this fortress, from the newest serving brother who arrived last month to the marshal who has fought 17 battles, rises at exactly the same moment. You are a knight of the temple, or perhaps of the hospital. The fortress around you is one of the most formidable structures ever built by human hands. Krak des Chevaliers, Castle Pilgrim, Belvoir, Margar, walls 12 feet thick, cisterns that hold enough water for a 5-year siege, storerooms packed with grain, oil and salted meat calculated down to the last ration. This place was built to be impossible to break. And so were you. That is the part no one tells you when they speak of the Crusader orders. They talk about the battles, Montgisard, Arsuf, the Horns of Hatton. They talk about the architecture, the relics, the banking networks, the politics. What they rarely describe is the machinery that produced the men who fought those battles, the daily, grinding, relentless system that took noblemen, merchants' sons and landless knights and rebuilt them from the inside out. It wasn't the sword training that made a Templar or Hospitaller unbreakable. It was Tuesday morning at 4 a.m. when the bell rang and you got up anyway. It was the 47th consecutive night of broken sleep during a siege and you still reported to your post. It was eating in silence while a brother read scripture aloud. It was handing your warhorse to a groom and having no opinion about it, because your horse was not your horse. It belonged to the order. It was wearing the same habit in July's killing heat and December's mountain cold because the rule said so. It was praying 7 times a day, not because you necessarily felt like it, but because the structure of the day was prayer, and without that structure, the whole thing collapsed. The Crusader military orders produced the most consistently lethal fighting men of the medieval world. Knights Templar never retreated unless outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. That was not bravado, it was written rule. Hospitaller cavalry held the rearguard at Arsuf under a hail of arrows, and did not break until Richard I personally gave the order. At the Siege of Acre, both orders maintained discipline in circumstances that caused other contingents to simply dissolve. Military historians have spent centuries asking why. The answer is inside these walls, inside the schedule, inside the silence at mealtimes, the specific cut of the habit, the precise rotation of the guard, the moments when a knight was permitted to speak and the long hours when he was not. I'm going to take you inside a single day, dawn to dawn, inside a 12th century Crusader order fortress. Not a battle, not a siege, an ordinary day, the kind that happened 360 times a year when nobody was attacking and nothing dramatic was occurring. Because those ordinary days are the whole secret. We are going to follow 3 men, a knight brother, newly professed, still learning the weight of his white mantle, a sergeant brother, a decade in, who runs the stable and knows the fortress better than he knows his own face, and the duty chaplain, who has been here long enough that the bells no longer wake him. He's already awake when they ring. What you will find inside this day is not what you expect. You will find bureaucracy and beauty, boredom and iron discipline, a system so precisely engineered that it could absorb the death of any individual man and continue functioning without a pause. A community of warriors who were also monks, and monks who were also warriors, and the daily reality of trying to be both at once without losing your mind. By the end of this day, you will understand something the chronicles never quite say plainly. The fortress wasn't just where these men lived, it was what they were made of. The bell has rung. It is the 3rd hour before dawn. The day has begun. The bell rings at 2 in the morning, not softly, not as an invitation. It rings the way iron rings when it means business, hard, flat, and final. And before its last echo has finished bouncing off the stone walls of the dormitory, every man in the room is moving. There is no moment of confusion, no slow surfacing from sleep. The rule does not permit that luxury. You are asleep, and then you are not. And the distance between those 2 states is exactly the length of 1 bell stroke. The dormitory is a long, low-ceilinged room carved from the same pale limestone as the rest of the fortress. There are no private chambers for knight brothers, No curtains between pallets, no concession to individual comfort. The rule of the temple is explicit on this point. Brothers sleep together, in common, with a lamp burning through the night so that no darkness may hide what no darkness should contain. The light is not for comfort, it is for accountability. Every man is visible to every other man, always, and this is entirely the point. You're sleeping in your clothes. That too is rule. Your habit, your belt, your shoes, all on, because a man who sleeps dressed is a man who can fight in 90 seconds. And in this country, 90 seconds is sometimes the entire margin between a fortress that stands and one that falls. The straw pallet beneath you is your concession to human frailty. The stone floor is what waits underneath it to remind you that frailty is temporary and stone is not. Around you, 30, 40, 60 men. The number depends on the fortress, the season, the current state of the current campaign. Rise in the same moment. The sounds are specific and unremarkable. The scratch of leather on stone, the soft percussion of men pulling cloaks tighter against a cold that has come down hard from the hills overnight. The collective exhalation of bodies surrendering warmth they spent 4 hours accumulating. Nobody speaks. The great silence that began after Compline last night has not yet ended, and in a community where the rules of speech are as precisely governed as the rules of warfare, silence in the dormitory at 2 a.m. is not awkward or heavy. It is simply the climate of this hour. The walk to the chapel takes you through the heart of the fortress. This is not accidental. The men who designed these buildings, and they were designed, with an intentionality that modern archaeology keeps confirming, placed the chapel where you had to pass through the fortress's core to reach it. At Krak des Chevaliers, the great Hospitaller stronghold that squats on its Syrian ridgeline like something that grew there rather than was built, the chapel sits at the centre of the inner ward, surrounded on all sides by the infrastructure of military life, the stables, the storerooms, the great hall, the walls. To reach God, you walk through everything that sustains your ability to defend him. The architecture is a theology. In the pre-dawn dark, the courtyard is cold enough to show your breath. The stars above the walls are extraordinary. In a world without artificial light, the Levantine sky at 2 a.m. is something that has to be seen to be understood. A density of stars that makes the darkness between them look almost incidental. The brother walking beside you has been here 11 years. He does not look up. He stopped looking up at the stars sometime around his 3rd year, when they became simply the ceiling of the night watch rather than a wonder. You are newer than that. You still look up briefly before the chapel door closes behind. You and the candlelight swallows the sky. Matins and lauds together constitute the longest office of the day. The psalms prescribed by the Templar Rule for this hour run to more than a dozen, chanted in the specific tones that centuries of monastic practice had refined into something that was simultaneously music, prayer, and mnemonic. You do not need the text. After the first months, the words live in your body rather than your mind. They emerge from the same place that makes your hands find the grip of a sword without looking, the place below thought where training becomes instinct. The chaplain leads, the brothers respond. The candles in their iron holders throw light that moves with the draughts coming under the chapel door, and the shadows of 60 men shift and steady and shift again against walls that have absorbed 30 years of the same words sung at the same hour. The office lasts perhaps an hour. Then the brothers file back to the dormitory for what the rule permits as a brief return to sleep before prime. This window, an hour and a half, perhaps 2 if the night has been quiet, is not what a civilian would recognize as rest. It is more like a controlled suspension of consciousness, the body performing sleep's maintenance functions with the focused efficiency of a craftsman who knows exactly how much time he has before the next task. Men who have lived by the bell for years develop a relationship with these fragments of sleep that is almost mechanical. You close your eyes, and some part of you that is not quite you counts the minutes, and when the count reaches its end, you are already half awake before the bell confirms it. Prime rings as the sky outside the dormitory's high, narrow windows moves from black to the particular dark blue that precedes dawn. By the time the brothers have assembled in the chapel again, the horizon beyond the walls is beginning to hold light the colour of old iron. The night watch is changing on the walls above. The day's first guard rotation, the men who have stood in the cold since Compline, watching the dark countryside for fires, for movement, for the specific silences that mean something is approaching, are being replaced by the morning watch, who arrive at their posts with faces that have not yet arranged themselves into the expressions the day requires. The chapter meeting follows prime in the Great Hall, and this is where the day formally constitutes itself. The master, or in his absence the marshal or the commander of the house, presides. Announcements first. Supply arrivals, patrol reports, any word from the network of rider messengers that connects this fortress to the others scattered across the hills and plains of Outremer. Then the accounting of yesterday's violations, brothers who spoke during the Great Silence, who handled their horse roughly, who failed to report for an office, who argued with a fellow brother in a manner the rule does not permit. The accused stands. The accusation is read. The penance is assigned. There is no defence offered and none expected. The chapter meeting is not a court. It is a calibration, the community checking itself against its own standard each morning, publicly, collectively, in a room where everyone can see the gap between the rule and the reality and measure it honestly. By the time the chapter meeting closes, the sun has fully risen over the eastern wall. You have been awake for 4 hours. You have prayed twice, slept once, stood in the cold, and sat in formal judgment of your community's failures, including perhaps your own. You have not yet eaten. You have not yet touched a weapon. The day has barely started. The morning meal does not come yet. This is the first thing a new brother learns, and it takes longer than you might expect to stop being surprised by it. The chapter meeting ends, the hall empties, and the instinct formed over a lifetime of civilian mornings, the instinct that says food follows, waking finds nothing to attach itself to. Breakfast, in the modern sense, does not exist here. The first meal of the day comes after terce, the third-hour office, which means that by the time you eat anything, you have been awake for 5 hours, prayed 3 times, and already begun the morning's work. The hunger is not considered a problem. It is considered a condition, like the cold or the weight of chain mail, something the body presents and the will declines to negotiate with. Terce itself is brief, the shortest of the morning offices, a pivot point rather than a destination. Where matins and lauds were long and immersive, pulling the brothers deep into the liturgical hours before dawn, terce is almost functional, a formal hinge between the spiritual opening of the day and the working hours that follow. The psalms are fewer, the chanting quicker, and when the chapel empties after terce there is a different quality to the movement of men through the courtyard. The contemplative stillness of the pre-dawn hours has been replaced by something purposeful. Assignments have been distributed. The fortress has work to do, and the fortress does not wait. The stables are the first great enterprise of the morning. In a Crusader order fortress of any significant size, the horse lines represent an investment so substantial that their maintenance was treated with the seriousness of a military operation, because that is precisely what it was. The rule of the temple allocated each knight brother 3 horses, a destrier for battle, a palfrey for travel, and a general riding horse for daily use, plus a turka pole mount in certain circumstances, and 1 squire responsible for their care. The sergeant brother who has managed this stable for a decade moves through it, the way a craftsman moves through his workshop, with the unhurried confidence of a man who knows where everything is, and what condition it is in, and what it will need before it needs it. The destriers demand the most attention. These animals, large, aggressive, trained from foalhood for the specific violence of a cavalry charge, are not easy horses in the way that a palfrey is easy. They have opinions. They communicate those opinions physically and without warning, and a brother who is not paying attention in the horse lines will carry the bruise to remind him. The morning routine involves checking each animal for lameness, sores from harness, the specific signs of the respiratory illnesses that spread quickly through enclosed stabling in the Levantine heat. Feed is measured and recorded. Water is hauled from the fortress cistern, and in a fortification designed to survive a siege of years, the cisterns are among the most carefully maintained structures in the entire complex. Krak de Chevaliers held cisterns capable of supplying the garrison for 5 years, and the men who maintained those water levels understood that they were maintaining the margin between survival and surrender. While the stables absorb their share of the morning's labour, the armoury makes its own demands. Chainmail in the Levantine climate is in a permanent negotiation with rust. The combination of coastal humidity, the sweat of men who wear armour for hours at a time, and the salt air that penetrates even the thickest stone walls means that mail left unattended for even a few days begins to show the orange signatures of oxidation along its rings. The maintenance process is specific and physical. Coils of mail are placed in barrels of coarse sand and rolled, the friction stripping rust from the interlocked rings in a process that requires time and effort, and produces a distinctive rasping sound that becomes, after long enough in a fortress, simply another note in the acoustic texture of the working morning. Broken rings are replaced by brothers with enough metalworking skill to relink them cleanly, and the archaeological evidence from major Crusader sites shows the scale of on-site metalworking infrastructure, hearths, anvils, stocks of raw iron, that kept these garrisons functional without depending entirely on supply lines that an enemy could cut. The hospitaller fortress adds a dimension that the purely martial imagination tends to overlook. The rule of the hospital assigned the care of the sick a priority so absolute that it bordered on the theologically radical. The master of the hospital was required, in the language of the rule itself, to regard the sick as his lords, not as his charges, not as his responsibility, but as his lords, to be served with the deference owed to superiors. The fortress infirmary was consequently one of the most sophisticated medical facilities in the medieval world, drawing on Arabic pharmaceutical knowledge, Byzantine clinical practice, and the accumulated experience of an institution that had been treating pilgrims in the Levant since before it became a military order at all. The morning rounds in a hospitaller infirmary involved dietary prescriptions specific to each patient's condition, the preparation of medicinal compounds from a pharmacopoeia that would have been recognizable to a physician trained in Cairo or Constantinople, and the work of brother nurses who had no military role and no expectation of one, men whose entire vocation within the order was healing, administered with the same disciplined regularity that governed everything else inside these walls. Sext arrives at midday and the work stops, not gradually, not at the discretion of whoever is in the middle of a task, but immediately at the bell, because the rule does not recognize the logic of finishing what you started before attending to what the hour requires. The interruption is the point. A man who can put down his work at a bell's command without resentment has developed a relationship with his own will that makes him considerably more useful in the situations where his will is the only thing standing between a held position and a broken one. The refectory at the midday meal is the fullest room in the fortress. The food is plain and sufficient. Bread, legumes, oil, meat on the days the rule permits it, distributed without distinction of rank, the master eating from the same provision as the newest serving brother. A reader stands at the lectern and reads aloud from scripture or hagiography, and the silence of 60 men eating while a single voice fills the room is one of the stranger sounds the fortress produces. Not uncomfortable, not penitential, simply ordered, in the way that everything here is ordered, the meal made into something that belongs to the community rather than to the individual appetite. By the time the refectory empties and the afternoon begins to assert itself, the fortress has functioned since dawn as stable, hospital, armory and monastery simultaneously. The sword has not yet been lifted. It does not need to be. The work of the morning is what makes the sword possible, and the men who understand this are the men who last. None rings at the 9th hour and the afternoon shifts. It is a subtle change, the kind you feel before you can name it. The working morning has a particular texture, purposeful, distributed, the fortress functioning as a series of parallel enterprises that rarely intersect. The afternoon has a different quality. It draws inward. The maintenance work that occupied the morning hours does not stop entirely, but it recedes, and what moves to the centre of the day is something more concentrated, more deliberate, more explicitly concerned with the business of violence. The training begins without ceremony. There is no formal assembly, no address from the marshal, no ritual framing of what is about to happen. Brothers move to the practice yard the way they move to the chapel, because the bell has indicated the hour and the hour has its assignment, and in a life governed entirely by the relationship between time and obligation, the movement itself is the acknowledgement. The practice yard at a major Crusader fortress is not a decorative feature. At sites like Belvoir, the hospitaller castle whose concentric walls rise above the Jordan Valley, like a textbook of 12th century military engineering, the internal spaces were designed with the practical geometry of a garrison that needed room to work. Stone flags worn smooth by decades of footwork, racks for wooden practice weapons along the walls, the smell of sawdust and iron and the particular sharpness of men beginning to sweat in afternoon heat. What the rule of the temple specifies about training is, at first glance, surprisingly sparse. The reason is not indifference, it is assumption. A man who arrived at the order as a knight brother came already formed as a fighting man. He had trained since childhood, had likely seen combat before his profession, and understood the basic grammar of mounted warfare in the way that a literate man understands the alphabet. What the order provided was not instruction in the fundamentals. It provided the advanced and specific curriculum of an institution that had developed its own doctrine over decades of continuous combat experience in a theatre unlike anything Western Europe produced. The Templar battle regulations, embedded in the retraits section of the rule, describe a system of mounted combat so precisely choreographed that it reads less like military guidance and more like the score of a very dangerous piece of music. The charge formation, the role of the standard bearer, the specific conditions under which a brother was permitted to leave the formation to aid a fallen comrade, the exact threshold, 3-to-1 odds, below which retreat was forbidden regardless of circumstances. These were not abstract principles. They were rehearsed until the body knew them independently of the mind, until the response to a falling standard or a broken formation was already happening before the conscious decision to respond had completed itself. That kind of drilling does not happen in a single afternoon. It accumulates over years of afternoons identical to this one, each session adding another layer to a foundation that was being built for the specific conditions of the next battle nobody could predict. The lance work comes first, because the lance is the weapon that wins or loses the first 30 seconds of an engagement, and the first 30 seconds of an engagement often determine everything that follows: the approach, the drop to charging position, the maintenance of formation integrity, when the horses begin to accelerate, and every instinct screams to press forward faster than the man beside you. These things are drilled on foot with weighted poles before they are drilled on horseback, because a mistake on foot produces a bruise, and a mistake on horseback at full charge produces a catastrophe. The knight brother who arrived 3 months ago is still working on foot. The sergeant brother who has been here a decade coaches him with the patience of a man who knows exactly which mistake is coming because he made it himself in his second month, and remembers the specific embarrassment of it with perfect clarity. The horses enter the afternoon's work gradually. Destriers brought out from the morning's stable routine, exercised through formations that the horses themselves have learned as thoroughly as their riders. A warhorse that has been trained correctly does not merely carry its rider into battle, it participates. The biting, the kicking, the sheer physical aggression of a trained destrier in close combat was documented enough times in the chronicles to be understood as a tactical element rather than an accident. Training the horse and training the rider were not separate enterprises. They were a single project, and the afternoon's work moved between them with the fluid practicality of men who understood that the relationship between a knight and his destrier was one of the most consequential relationships in his life, more reliable in certain respects than any human bond the order permitted. Then, at a point that the experienced brothers recognize by the quality of the light, rather than by any bell, the yard quiets. Not because training ends, but because the grand silence has extended its reach into the afternoon hours. The Templar Rule designated specific periods of the day as silences, not the absolute great silence that followed Compline, but a structured quiet during which unnecessary speech was prohibited, and brothers communicated through the documented hand signal system that the order had developed for exactly this purpose. A closed fist meant one thing, an open hand another, the gesture for water, for a weapon, for permission to speak to the master. A vocabulary of movement that was both practical and, in its way, philosophically coherent. A community that could function in silence was a community that had removed from itself one of the primary mechanisms through which discipline erodes, the constant low-level noise of complaint, speculation, and faction that accumulates in any group of men under pressure and eventually poisons it. The silence also did something to the training that no amount of instruction could replicate. A man drilling in silence attends differently, without the option of commentary, without the release valve of muttering about fatigue or frustration, or the weight of a practice weapon on a hot afternoon. The attention has nowhere to go but inward and forward, into the body's performance and the task's demands. The brothers who had been inside the order's silence for years moved through the practice yard with an economy of motion that newer men found either impressive or unsettling depending on their temperament. There was nothing wasted. Not a gesture, not a step, not a breath expended on anything that did not serve the immediate purpose. Vespers pulls the afternoon to its close. The light over the eastern wall has gone from white to gold to the particular amber that means an hour of visibility remains, and the evening guard rotation is assembling on the wall walks above. The chapel fills for the fifth office of the day, and the chanting that rises from it carries across the courtyard and up to the men on the walls, who hear it the way sailors hear a bell through fog, as orientation, as confirmation that the structure holds, that the day is proceeding as the day is supposed to proceed. The sword goes back to the rack, the horses go back to the lines. The silence that began in the practice yard migrates into the evening without a clear boundary, becoming the silence of men who have worked their bodies to a useful tiredness, and have nothing left to prove before the night arrives. The afternoon has held both the day's most explicit violence and its longest quiet. In another context, that combination might seem contradictory. Here, inside these walls, it makes a kind of sense that goes beyond explanation. The silence was not the opposite of the steel. It was the condition that made the steel possible, and the men who had learned to move between the two without losing anything in the transition were, in the fullest sense, what this place had been built to produce. The evening meal is quieter than the midday one. Not because the rule requires more silence at this hour. The regulations governing the refectory are the same morning and evening, but because the day has done something to the men that the morning had not yet accomplished. By the time the brothers assemble for the evening meal, they have been awake for nearly 18 hours, interrupted only by the fragment of sleep between matins and prime that the body accepts gratefully and the mind barely registers. The food is similar to midday, bread, oil, whatever the kitchen has produced from the fortress stores, and the reader at the lectern reads, in the same steady voice he used at noon, but the room receives it differently. The morning meal was fuel taken before effort. The evening meal is something closer to a reckoning, the body presenting its account of the day, and the community sitting together in the acknowledgement of it. Compline follows, and Compline is unlike any of the other offices. The earlier hours of prayer, matins, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, each carry the character of their position in the day. They are pivot points, transitions, the liturgical punctuation of a day organised around labour and discipline. Compline is none of those things. It is the only office that belongs entirely to darkness, and the psalms prescribed for it reflect that belonging with a directness that the other hours do not quite achieve. The words are concerned with sleep, with vulnerability, with the soul's exposure during the unconscious hours when the will is suspended and the body lies open to whatever the night contains. In a fortress in Outremer, where the night genuinely contained enemies, the theology of Compline was not metaphorical. The prayers for protection through darkness were offered by men who understood protection through darkness as a practical rather than a spiritual category, and the two meanings reinforced each other in a way that gave the evening office a weight the others did not carry. When Compline ends, the great silence begins. It begins immediately, completely, and without exception. The brothers file from the chapel into a fortress that has, in the space of a single bell stroke, become a different kind of place. The sounds that remain are structural. The wind against the walls, the horses shifting in the stables, the distant calls of the night watch establishing their positions on the wall walks above. But the human sounds, the incidental noise of a community going about its business, disappear as if a door has closed on them. Men move through the corridors to the dormitory without speaking. The lamp is already burning. The pallets receive their occupants. The great silence is not merely the absence of speech. It is a presence, something the community inhabits collectively, and a man who has lived inside it for long enough begins to experience it not as a deprivation but as a texture, the specific quality of an environment that has agreed to put down the instrument of language and exist for a while without it. But not everyone sleeps. The night watch is the most demanding assignment the fortress produces, and it produces it every night without exception, in fair weather and foul, in seasons of campaign and seasons of relative peace. The men who draw the night rotation leave the dormitory as their brothers settle into it, moving up to the wall walks through the same corridors in reverse, exchanging the warmth of collective sleep for the cold specificity of a post that must be held until the dawn watch arrives to relieve them. The Templar rules, regulations governing the night watch, are precise in the way that all the rules' military provisions are precise. No sleeping at your post, specific patrol routes maintained at specific intervals, accountability systems built into the rotation, so that a brother who sat down against the wall and closed his eyes for 20 minutes would be discovered not by luck but by design. The wall walk at 2 in the morning is one of the loneliest places the medieval world produced. The countryside below the fortress stretches away into a darkness that is total except for the stars, and the stars, magnificent as they are, provide orientation rather than comfort. The brother on watch can see the fires of distant villages if the night is clear, can trace the line of a road by the paleness of it against darker ground, can identify the movement of large bodies of men or animals at distances that would surprise anyone who has not stood a long watch and learned what the eye becomes capable of when it has nothing to do for 3 hours except look. What he is looking for is specific: fires where fires should not be, movement that follows the logic of approach rather than the logic of ordinary night travel, the particular silence that falls over the natural world when something large and purposeful is moving through it. Most nights he finds nothing. This is the part of the watch that the chronicles do not record and the histories do not describe, because nothing is not a story. But nothing sustained over months and years of identical nights is where the psychological cost of this life accumulates most honestly. A battle is terrible and clarifying. It demands everything, and in demanding everything temporarily resolves the question of who you are and what you are for. A night watch offers no such resolution. It offers 3 hours of cold and darkness, and the company of your own mind, and your own mind, after long enough inside the Order's silence, has been stripped of most of the ordinary furniture that civilian minds use to furnish the quiet hours. There is no gossip to replay, no plans for personal advancement to elaborate, no private relationships whose details can be turned over and examined. The rule has removed most of the material that ordinary interior monologue is made of, and what remains is something starker and more honest: the direct encounter between a man and the question of whether the life he has given himself to is worth the cost of living it. The records of chapter meetings from this period contain, scattered among the routine accountings of rule violations and supply inventories, occasional references to brothers who broke in ways that the system could not absorb, men who fled the fortress in the night, whose absence was discovered at prime when their pallet was empty, and the gate guard had no memory of authorizing passage. Men who were found on the wall walk not at their post but sitting with their backs against the parapet, not sleeping but not watching either, simply stopped. The mechanism of will that kept them moving through the day's requirements having reached a limit the rule had not anticipated. The Order dealt with these failures through the chapter meeting, public, formal, without cruelty but without softness either, and the penances assigned to men who abandoned their watch or their vows were severe enough to function as deterrent while stopping short of the permanent exclusion that was reserved for the gravest violations. What the system could not entirely account for was the interior collapse that preceded the visible one. The fortress could monitor a man's behaviour. It could not monitor what the night watch was doing to the part of him that behaviour only imperfectly expressed. And yet most of them held. This is the fact that sits at the centre of the Crusader Order's history and refuses to be entirely explained by discipline alone. The system was demanding to the point of cruelty. The life it produced was one of radical self-abnegation, and the men inside it had given up everything that ordinary human existence uses to make itself bearable. Privacy, property, family, the freedom to speak when speech would help. And most of them, most nights, stood their watch, returned to the dormitory, slept there 4 hours, and rose at the bell without being asked twice. The explanation the Order itself offered was theological, and it would be a mistake to dismiss it, simply because it is unfashionable. These men believed, with a specificity and a seriousness that is difficult to recover from this distance, that the structure they were living inside was not a human invention, but a divine one, that the bell and the rule and the silence and the cold wall walk at 2 in the morning were the shape that God's service took in this particular time and place, and that the difficulty was not incidental to the vocation, but essential to it, pain as participation, endurance as offering. The watch that found nothing as meaningful as the watch that found an army, because both were the same act of fidelity performed in the same darkness for the same reason. Dawn comes slowly to a fortress. The sky above the eastern wall moves through its gradations, black to deep blue to the grey that precedes colour, and the man on the wall walk sees it arrive in a way that the man in the dormitory does not, has watched the specific moment when the stars nearest the horizon begin to fade and the land below starts to separate itself from the darkness that had swallowed it whole. There is something in that moment, documented often enough in the literature of monastic night prayer to be considered a genuine phenomenon rather than a literary convention that makes the hours before it retrospectively bearable. The night held. The watch was kept. The fortress stands in the morning exactly as it stood the evening before, which is not a small thing in a country that has been consuming fortresses for a century. The bell rings. In the dormitory, the night brother who has been with us since yesterday's pre-dawn darkness opens his eyes. He is already moving before the echo fades, his body having learned the bell the way it has learned the grip of a sword, below the level of decision, in the place where repetition becomes reflex. He does not think about the day ahead. The day ahead is the same as the day behind, which is the same as the day before that, which is the same as every day he has lived inside these walls, and every day he will live inside them until the order releases him to the earth. He pulls his cloak straight, checks the lamp still burning, and moves toward the door. The rule continues. The fortress holds.